kind farmer gave $25 to a boy who was hungry. 25 years later, a millionaire knocked on his door. Green Hollow was the kind of place where life moved slowly, and the land was as stubborn as the people who lived there. The dry, cracked earth stretched as far as the eye could see, with only a few patches of green struggling to survive under the relentless sun. John lived in this town his whole life and worked in the fields every day. He wasn't a rich man by any means, but he took pride in what little he had: a modest house, a small patch of farmland, and a loved family. His wife, Mary, always had a smile ready, no matter how hard the day had been. Ellen, their only daughter, made their lives so much better with her laughter, which could be heard like a song even on the worst, hottest days. Life wasn't easy, but they had each other, and that was enough. John was working in the field on a very hot afternoon when he saw something strange off in the distance. Younger than 12 or 13, the boy was hunched over under an old, half-dead tree on the edge of their land. John took a moment to wipe the sweat off his forehead. The boy was looking through the empty trees for something, anything. His clothes were torn, his face dirty. John's heart sank. He walked over, slow and deliberate, so as not to scare the kid. When he got closer, he could see how thin the boy was, his ribs nearly visible through his shirt. "You all right there, son?" John asked, his voice soft but carrying the weight of worry. The boy looked up, surprised, his big brown eyes filled with a mix of fear and hunger. He didn't speak, just shook his head, holding a handful of dried-out leaves. John sighed. "Come on now. Let's get you inside, get you something to eat." For a moment, the boy paused, as if he didn't believe what he was hearing. But when John turned and started going toward the house, the boy followed, his bare feet kicking up small clouds of dust with every step. Inside, Mary was making dough for bread when they came through the door. She didn't ask questions, just gave John a knowing look and set another plate at the table. She ladled out a bowl of soup for the boy, who ate like he hadn't seen food in days. John watched, his heart heavy, thinking where the boy had come from and how he had ended up in such a state. When the boy had finished, John leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "What's your name, son?" "Michael," the boy mumbled between bites of bread. "And where are your folks, Michael?" Michael dropped his head. "Don't got none." John and Mary shared a glance, and John's heart ached for the boy. No child should have to fend for themselves like that. John stood up and reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a small, crumpled wad of bills. $25. The only money he had saved up to buy seeds for the next growing season. He put it on the table in front of Michael. "Take this," John said, his voice quiet but strong. "It's not much, but it'll get you on your way. You can use it to get to town, maybe find a place to stay, someone who can help you." Michael looked at the money, his eyes wide. He didn't reach for it. "I can't take that," he whispered. John shook his head. "You can, and you will. It's what you need right now. Just promise me you'll do something good with it." The boy's lip quivered as he took the money, his hands shaking. He looked up at John, tears welling in his eyes. "I promise, sir. I'll pay you back someday. I'll come back and I'll repay you for this." John smiled softly, patting the boy's shoulder. "Don't worry about paying me back, Michael. Just take care of yourself." Michael stood up, clutching the money tightly in his hand. He didn't say much as he left, just a quiet thank you before walking out the door and disappearing down the dirt road. John watched him go, feeling a strange mix of hope and sadness. He had done what he could, but the world was a hard place for a kid like Michael. Still, there was something in the boy's eyes, something that told John that maybe, just maybe, things would turn out all right for him. That night, as John and Mary sat by the fire, Mary looked over at him, her face soft. "Do you think we'll ever see that boy again?" John shrugged, looking into the flames. "Maybe. But even if we don't, I reckon we did the right thing. The world needs more kindness, Mary, and if that boy's going to make it, he'll need all the kindness he can get." Mary smiled, putting her head on John's shoulder. "You're a good man, John. The world could use more people like you." John didn't say anything, just held her close, the warmth of the fire washing over them as the cool night air settled in. The land might be tough, the times might be harder, but tonight, for just a moment, they had hope. The days in Green Hollow passed as they always had, slow and steady, marked by the rising and setting of the relentless sun. Life for John and his family went on, with the thought of Michael slowly fading into the background. Yet the boy's quiet "thank you" and his promise to return someday lingered in John's thoughts. He didn't expect much from it. Life had taught him not to. But there was something about the truthfulness in Michael's voice that stuck with him. Weeks turned into months, and the months into years. John continued his daily routine, working the fields from dawn till dusk, always trying to make the most out of what little the land offered. The money he had given Michael, though missed, didn't feel like a loss. It was as if he had planted something deeper, a seed of hope that one day might bear fruit. Not that John ever expected to see Michael again. He didn't even know where the boy had gone, but deep down, he held on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, Michael was out there somewhere, making something of himself. Mary, as usual, kept the house running. She never whined, though John knew things were hard for her. The work never stopped, and with their daughter Ellen growing older, there were new issues to think about: school fees, supplies, and the ever-present worry of whether they could make it through the next season. But like John, Mary didn't speak much of these problems. They were a part of life, and they faced them with the quiet strength that defined so many in Green Hollow. Ellen, though, was the bright spot in their lives. Even on the most tough days, her laughter filled the small house, bringing warmth and light. She had received her mother's smile and her father's quiet determination. From a young age, she had taken to helping on the farm, doing what she could to lighten the load. But as she grew older, it became clear that Ellen had bigger dreams than the farm could hold. "I want to be a teacher," she had told John one evening, her eyes shining with joy. "I want to help kids, just like you helped Michael." John had smiled at that, his heart swelling with joy. He knew they didn't have the money to send Ellen to college, but the way she talked about it, he couldn't bring himself to dampen her spirit. Instead, he encouraged her dreams, telling her to work hard and stay focused. Maybe, he thought, things would fall into place somehow. It wasn't long after Ellen's statement that her health started to decline. At first, it was just little things: fatigue, the odd cough, but it didn't take long for the symptoms to worsen. The doctors in town couldn't figure out exactly what was wrong, but they all agreed on one thing: Ellen needed care, and it wasn't going to be cheap. John and Mary were heartbroken. Their world, already fragile, seemed to be falling around them. The little savings they had wouldn't be enough to cover the costs, and without the money, Ellen's future, their future, looked bleak. John, for the first time in years, found himself feeling truly helpless. One evening, as they sat around the table, the weight of the situation pressing down on them, Ellen looked up at her father. "We'll figure it out, Dad. We always do." Wait. If you have not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe now, as it keeps us motivated for bringing more awesome stories. Now, let's back to the story. John smiled at her, but the sadness in his eyes betrayed his true thoughts. "I'm not so sure this time, Ellen, but we'll keep trying." The truth was, John didn't know what to do. He had always been able to provide for his family, even if it meant going without himself. But this was beyond him. He had no idea where to turn or how to make things right. One day, as John was working in the field, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. He paused, squinting against the sun as the shape of a big vehicle came into view. It was rare for anyone to drive out this way. Most of the folks in Green Hollow didn't even have cars that fancy. As the vehicle grew closer, John could see it was a sleek black SUV, the kind of car that only someone with money would own. His heart began to race as the car slowed to a stop in front of the house. A man stepped out, dressed neatly in a suit, his shoes glinting in the sunlight. John stood still, unsure of what to think as the man approached. Something about him seemed familiar, the way he moved, the look in his eyes. "Mr. J.N., the man called out, his voice clear and confident. John wrinkled his brow. "That's me?" The man smiled, and in that moment, John saw it, the boy he had helped all those years ago. It was Michael, now a grown man standing before him, dressed in the best clothes J.N. had ever seen. "Michael?" John asked, barely believing his eyes. Michael nodded, his smile widening. "It's been a long time, hasn't it?" J.N. was speechless. He had always wondered what had happened to the boy, but never in his wildest dreams had he imagined this. Michael, no longer the skinny, hungry kid who had walked onto his farm, was now standing before him as a man of wealth and success. Michael stepped forward, extending his hand. I made a promise to you all those years ago, and I intend to keep it. John shook his hand, still in shock. What do you mean? Michael's eyes softened, and with a sincerity that brought back memories of their first meeting, he said, You saved my life that day, Mr. John. Now it's my turn to help you. John stood there, his mind racing as he took in the sight of Michael. No longer the frail, hungry boy he had once helped, but now a confident, successful man. Time had done more than just change their lives. It had changed them completely. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was filled with memories, of a kind gesture, of a promise made under the burning sun, and of years spent wondering what had happened to the boy who disappeared down the dirt road. I can't believe it's really you, John finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to ease the stress in the air. I never forgot what you did for me, Mr. JN, not for 1 second. I owe you everything. John waved his hand dismissively, shaking his head. You don't owe me anything, son. I did what anyone would have done. Michael's face turned serious, his eyes locking onto John's. No, not everyone would have done that. You and your family saved me when I had nothing. I was just a scared kid with no one to turn to, and you gave me a chance. I've never forgotten that. John's thoughts went back to that day, how Michael had seemed so lost, so helpless. It had been an act of pure reflex to help him, something he didn't think twice about. But now, standing in front of this man who had turned his life around, John began to understand just how significant that moment had been. Let's sit, Michael said, pointing toward the front porch. I want to tell you everything. They made their way to the old wooden chairs on the porch, the same ones that had been there for years. Michael glanced around, taking in the surroundings with a fond smile. The house hadn't changed much, except for the wear and tear that time had imposed on it. John sat down heavily, his mind still struggling to understand the reality of the situation. You look good, JN said, his voice a mix of pride and wonder. Seems like life's treated you well. Michael nodded, leaning back in the chair. I've been blessed, Mr. John, more than I could have ever imagined. He paused, looking out at the fields. Those $25 you gave me, they were everything. I used that money to buy a bus ticket to the city. I didn't have much of a plan, but I knew I had to get out of here if I was ever going to make something of myself. John listened closely as Michael recounted the story of his life after leaving Green Hollow. He had arrived in the city with nothing but the clothes on his back and the desire to make a better life. At first, things had been tough, sleeping in shelters, doing odd jobs just to get by. But slowly, Michael had made his way up. He had found teachers along the way, people who believed in him and helped him get an education. Eventually, he had built a successful business from the ground up. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. You gave me the start I needed. I've spent the last 25 years working, trying to make something of myself, and every day I thought about you and your family. John felt a lump form in his throat. He had always thought what had become of Michael, but he had never expected something like this. We're proud of you, Michael, John said softly. You've done well. Michael smiled, but there was a sadness behind his eyes. I know things haven't been easy for you either, Mr. John. That's why I'm here. I want to return the kindness you showed me. John opened his mouth to complain, but Michael held up his hand. I know you're proud, and I respect that, but this isn't charity. This is me keeping my word. I want to help. Before JN could reply, the front door creaked open, and Mary stepped out onto the porch, her eyes widening in surprise when she saw Michael. Is that Michael? John said, standing up and gesturing toward their visitor. You remember Michael, don't you? Mary's face lit up with recognition, and she hurried over, pulling Michael into a tight hug. Oh my goodness, look at you, all grown up and successful. She stepped back, taking a good look at him. We've wondered about you for so long. Michael grinned, clearly touched by the warm response. It's good to see you, Mrs. Mary. I've thought about you and Mr. JN every day. They all sat down, and Michael continued to tell his story. John and Mary listened, captivated by the trip this young boy had taken and the man he had become, the struggles, the hard work, and the triumphs. It was a story of resilience, but also of thanks. And through it all, Michael made one thing clear. He had never forgotten the kindness shown to him. As the sun started to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, The conversation turned to the present. Michael's gaze shifted to JN, his face turning serious once more. "I know times have been tough for you," Michael said, his voice soft. "I heard about Ellen, about her illness." John's heart clenched. Ellen was always at the forefront of his mind, her declining health casting a shadow over every part of their lives. "She's not well," he admitted quietly. "We've been trying to get her the help she needs, but we don't have the money." Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "That's why I'm here. I want to help. Whatever it takes to get her the care she needs, I'll cover it. Doctors, hospitals, whatever. I'll make sure she gets the best care." John looked at him, unable to believe what he was hearing. It was too much. He had never expected this, never thought that the boy he had helped so long ago would come back and offer something so amazing. "I can't let you do that," JN said, shaking his head. "It's too much." Michael leaned forward, his eyes filled with purpose. "Mr. John, you saved my life. Now let me help save hers." The quiet evening air settled around the house as Michael's words lingered in John's thoughts. The offer to help Ellen, to provide the care she so badly needed, felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. But there was still that annoying voice in John's head, the one that told him he couldn't accept so much from anyone, not even from someone like Michael. He had spent his whole life working, providing for his family, and depending on others had never been part of the plan. John leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Michael, I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever expected." Michael smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I didn't come back expecting anything from you, Mr. John. I came back because you gave me a chance when I had nothing. You helped me when no one else would. Now it's my turn to do the same." John shifted uncomfortably, his pride and thanks battling inside him. He looked at Mary, who sat quietly beside him, her hands resting in her lap. She was watching him closely, her face soft but knowing. She'd always been the more pragmatic of the two, and she could see the opportunity that Michael's return offered. Mary reached over and put her hand gently on John's arm. "John," she said softly, "maybe this is what we need. Maybe it's okay to let someone else help just this once." JN looked at her, his heart heavy. He knew she was right, but it was still hard to swallow. Accepting help wasn't something he was used to, but then he thought of Ellen, of her pale face, her tired eyes, the way she tried so hard to stay strong for them. If he didn't do something soon, it might be too late. "All right," John finally said, his voice rough with emotion. He looked at Michael, his eyes filled with a mixture of thanks and sadness. "All right, we'll accept your help." Michael's face broke into a relaxed smile, and he reached out to shake John's hand again. "Thank you," he said simply. John nodded, feeling a strange sense of both relief and sadness wash over him. It wasn't easy to accept help, especially from someone he'd once viewed as a child in need. But in that moment, he understood that life had come full circle. The boy he'd helped had grown into a man, and now that man was here to help him in return. The rest of the evening passed in quiet talk, with Michael sharing more about his life and his plans to stay in Green Hollow for a while. There was talk of doctors, treatment choices, and the logistics of getting Ellen the care she needed. But through it all, there was an underlying sense of hope, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, things would finally start to get better. As the last rays of the setting sun faded into the horizon, creating a golden glow over the fields, John felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Life had been hard, and the future was still unsure. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. Michael's return had brought with it a promise of mending, of help, and of hope. And for that, John was deeply, eternally thankful. Mary let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, and she squeezed John's arm reassuringly. "We're grateful, Michael," she said softly. "More than you know." Michael smiled, the tightness easing from his shoulders. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing what I've always wanted to do, paying back the kindness you showed me." As the talk shifted to the details of Ellen's treatment, John couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in a long while, there was a spark of hope, real hope, that Ellen might have a chance. The load that had weighed so heavily on his shoulders for months seemed to lighten just a little, and he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would turn out all right. The next morning, As the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, John sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hands. He stared out the window, watching the sun rise slowly over the field. The quiet moments of the morning had always been his favorite, the world still and calm before the day's work began, but today felt different. There was a nervous energy buzzing inside him, a mix of expectation and worry. Mary walked into the kitchen, her footsteps light as she approached him. "You're up early," she said, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Couldn't sleep," John revealed. "Got a lot on my mind." Mary nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting beside him. "It's going to be all right, you know. Michael's going to help. We're not alone in this anymore." John took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth spread through him. "I know. It's just, I still can't believe it. After all these years, he came back, and not just to say thank you. He's really going to help Ellen. It's more than I ever expected." Mary smiled softly. "Sometimes life surprises you. You did a good thing all those years ago, John, and now it's coming back to us in ways we never imagined." John nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and thanks. He had never done what he did for praise or repayment. He had helped Michael because it was the right thing to do. And now, all these years later, that kindness was being repaid tenfold. Later that day, Michael returned with a plan in place. He had already planned for a specialist to see Ellen at a hospital in the city. All the plans were made. Transportation, medical bills, everything. John and Mary were amazed at how quickly things had moved, and they couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by Michael's kindness. "I'll take care of everything," Michael promised them. "You just focus on getting Ellen ready. We'll leave tomorrow." John and Mary shared a glance, their hearts heavy with a mix of hope and anxiety. The thought of leaving Green Hollow, even for a short time, was frightening, but it was for Ellen's sake. They had to be strong for her. As the day drew to a close, Ellen, unaware of the full extent of Michael's plans, sat by the window, looking out at the fields. Her illness had taken so much from her, her energy, her spirit, but there was still a quiet strength in her that John respected. She had always been resilient, and he hoped that she would have the strength to fight this battle. John walked over to her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get you some help, Ellen. The best doctors there are. Michael's making sure of it." Ellen looked up at him, her eyes tired but grateful. "I don't know what to say, Dad." "You don't have to say anything," John answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just focus on getting better." The following morning was filled with a quiet but determined sense of urgency. Michael had arranged for a car to take John, Mary, and Ellen to the city for Ellen's treatment. And as the sun rose over the fields of Green Hollow, they all knew that this day marked the beginning of something new. John and Mary packed a small bag for the trip, careful to bring only what was required. Ellen, though weak, walked around the house slowly, trying to help where she could. "You don't need to worry about anything," Mary said gently, bringing Ellen back to her chair. "We'll take care of it all. You just need to rest." Ellen smiled, though it was a tired one. She was thankful for the help, but she hated feeling like a burden. She had always been strong, independent, and now this disease had taken so much from her, her energy, her freedom, and in some ways, her hope. But there was a light at the end of this dark tunnel, and that light was Michael. His return and the offer to help had given her a sense of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Michael arrived just as they were finishing up, his normal confident and calm demeanor putting them all at ease. He carried with him an air of confidence that everything was going to be all right. He greeted John and Mary with a warm smile and turned to Ellen with a look of genuine worry. "Ready for this?" Michael asked, his words soft but encouraging. Ellen nodded, her gaze meeting his. "As ready as I'll ever be." The drive to the city was quiet, with the hum of the car's engine filling the silence. John sat in the front passenger seat, looking out at the passing fields, his mind filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. He still couldn't quite believe this was all happening. Just days ago, he had been preparing himself for the worst, thinking there was no way out of the dire position Ellen was in. And now, thanks to Michael, there was a real chance she might get better. Mary sat in the back with Ellen, her hand resting on her daughter's knee in a silent sign of comfort. She was hopeful, but like John, there was a small part of her that feared failure. They had been through so much, and she didn't want to let herself believe in something, only to have it taken away. But as she looked at Michael, sitting comfortably behind the wheel, she couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to turn in their favor. The city loomed ahead of them, tall buildings and busy streets, a sharp contrast to the quiet, rural life they had always known. For Ellen, the sight was stunning. She hadn't been outside of Green Hollow in years, and the energy of the city was both exhilarating and frightening. But Michael seemed fully at ease, navigating the traffic with a practiced hand. "We're almost there," Michael said, looking at them in the rearview mirror. "The hospital is just up ahead. I spoke with the doctors again this morning. They're ready for us." Ellen felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. This was it. She was about to walk into a world she didn't understand, a world of tests and treatments, doctors and experts. It was a lot to take in, but she had to be strong. She had to believe that this was the beginning of her healing. When they arrived at the hospital, Michael parked the car and helped Ellen out, his hand steady as he led her through the entrance. The hospital was huge, filled with people bustling about, and the sterile smell of disinfectant hung in the air. Ellen's legs felt shaky beneath her, but Michael was right there by her side, his presence calming her worries. They were welcomed by a team of doctors and nurses, all of whom seemed to know Michael well. He had made sure that everything was in place, and the efficiency with which they were brought in and settled was amazing. Ellen was taken for some basic tests, and while she was gone, John and Mary sat in the waiting room with Michael. "This is more than we could have ever hoped for," Mary said calmly, her eyes welling with tears. "I don't know how we'll ever thank you, Michael." Michael shook his head. "There's nothing to thank me for. This is the least I could do. You helped me when I had nothing. Now it's my turn." John, who had been quiet for most of the day, finally spoke. "It's just hard to believe," he allowed. "We've been through so much. For the longest time, I thought there wasn't any hope left for Ellen." Michael leaned forward, his face serious. "There's always hope, Mr. John. That's something you taught me a long time ago. You gave me hope when I didn't have any, and now it's my turn to pass that on." John met Michael's gaze, and in that moment, he understood. It wasn't just about the money or the treatment. It was about something deeper. Michael wasn't here out of obligation. He was here because he truly cared. Because the kindness that John had shown him all those years ago had created a bond between them that went beyond mere gratitude. Hours passed as Ellen took her tests, and the waiting seemed endless. John and Mary sat in tense silence, their hands tightly clasped together. Michael, too, was quiet, though his calm exterior never changed. It was clear that he was just as involved in Ellen's recovery as they were. Finally, a doctor emerged from the back, his face neutral as he approached them. J.N. stood up, his heart beating in his chest. "How is she, Doc?" The doctor offered a comforting smile. "She's stable. We've completed the initial tests, and while we'll need to run a few more, I'm optimistic. We're going to start treatment right away." Mary let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding, and John felt the tightness in his body ease ever so slightly. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. "Thank you," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." The doctor nodded. "We're going to do everything we can for her. She's in good hands." As they settled back into the waiting room, Michael turned to John and Mary. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. "But we're in this together. Whatever happens, I'll be here." John looked at Michael, his heart full of thanks. It was hard to put into words how much this meant to him, to know that they weren't alone in this fight. For the first time in a long while, hope didn't feel like a faraway dream. It felt real. The days that followed were a rush of doctors, tests, and treatments. Ellen remained in the hospital, her body slowly responding to the care she was getting. Each day, John, Mary, and Michael would visit her, sitting by her bedside, giving comfort and encouragement. It was a long road, but the glimmers of improvement were there, small signs that Ellen was starting to regain some of her strength. Ellen, though tired, found herself feeling more hopeful than she had in months. The kindness and support from her family, and especially from Michael, gave her the courage to keep trying. She would often catch Michael watching her with a mixture of concern and admiration, and though she hadn't quite figured out what to make of it, she enjoyed his constant presence. "I'm feeling a little better today," Ellen would say on the days when her energy allowed her to speak more than a few words at a time. "That's good," Jan would reply, his face lighting up at the sound of her words. You just keep resting, sweetheart. We're all here with you. Mary would nod in agreement, squeezing Ellen's hand, while Michael sat quietly, his face unreadable but always supportive. He didn't have to say much. His deeds spoke louder than words. As the days turned into weeks, Ellen's situation continued to improve, though it was a slow and steady process. She began to regain some color in her face, and her strength started to return little by little. The doctors were hopeful, but they made it clear that the road to full recovery would be long and uncertain. During this time, Michael became more than just a supporter. He was there for every step of Ellen's journey, sitting with her through the long hours of treatment, holding her hand when the pain became too much, and offering words of support when she felt like giving up. One afternoon, as Ellen rested in her hospital bed, Michael sat by her side, flipping through a book he had brought her. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the machines that watched Ellen's vitals. Ellen, her eyes half closed, turned her head slightly to look at Michael. You don't have to stay here all the time, you know, she said softly, her voice still weak but getting strength. Michael glanced up from the book, his eyes meeting hers. I want to be here, he said simply. You don't have to go through this alone. Ellen smiled faintly, touched by his earnestness. She had never known someone like Michael, someone who seemed to truly care about her well-being without expecting anything in return. It was a strange feeling, but a reassuring one. You've done so much for me already, she said after a moment. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Michael shook his head. You don't owe me anything, Ellen. I'm not doing this because I expect something in return. I'm doing it because I want to. You're important to me. Ellen's smile faded slightly as she processed his words. There was something in the way he said it, the way he looked at her, that made her heart skip a beat. She wasn't sure if it was the medicine or her own feelings, but there was a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You don't have to say anything, Michael answered, his gaze steady and calm. Just focus on getting better. That's all I want. Ellen closed her eyes, feeling a wave of tiredness wash over her. But before she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't help but think about Michael, about his kindness, his constant support, and the way he made her feel safe in a way she hadn't expected. As Ellen's situation continued to improve, so did the bond between her and Michael. What had started as a simple act of gratitude on Michael's part was slowly turning into something deeper, something neither of them had expected. Michael found himself drawn to Ellen in ways that went beyond his initial desire to return the kindness her family had shown him. There was a link between them, one that grew stronger with each passing day. For John and Mary, it was a relief to see Ellen healing. Her health had been their biggest fear for so long, and now, with the help of Michael and the doctors, there was finally a light at the end of the tunnel. But as they watched Ellen and Michael together, they couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in their relationship. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, John and Mary sat in the hospital's small canteen, sipping on lukewarm coffee. The day had been a good one. Ellen was showing signs of real progress, and for the first time in a long while, they felt like they could breathe a little easier. You've noticed it too, haven't you? Mary asked, breaking the familiar silence between them. John looked at her, raising an eyebrow. Noticed what? Michael and Ellen, Mary said, her tone light but knowing. There's something going on between them. John frowned, leaning back in his chair. You think so? Mary smiled softly. I've seen the way he looks at her, John. He cares about her, and I think she's starting to feel the same. John let out a long breath, running a hand through his graying hair. I don't know, Mary. Michael's been nothing but good to us, but this is Ellen. I just don't want her to get hurt. Mary reached across the table and put her hand on his. I don't think he would hurt her, John. Michael's a good man. He's been there for her every step of the way. Maybe this is something good, something we didn't see coming. John nodded slowly, though the watchful father in him wasn't so easily convinced. He trusted Michael. He had no reason not to. But the thought of his daughter becoming attached to someone who had come into their lives under such unusual circumstances made him uncomfortable. Still, he couldn't deny that Michael had done more for their family than they could have ever hoped for. I suppose we'll just have to see how it plays out, John said, his voice dejected but not without hope. Over the next few weeks, Ellen's healing continued. The treatments were working, and the doctors were cautiously hopeful about her long-term prognosis. Each day, she grew a little stronger, her mood lifting as her health improved. And with that improvement came the slow, undeniable understanding that her feelings for Michael were changing. What had once been gratitude was changing into something more. She couldn't deny the growing link between them, the way her heart seemed to skip a beat whenever he walked into the room. And as much as she tried to push those feelings away, she found it harder and harder to ignore. One evening, as Michael sat by her bedside reading aloud from a book, Ellen found herself watching him. Really watching him. His focus on the words, the way his voice softened with each turn of the page, the way he seemed to be completely at ease in her company. There was something about him that made her feel safe, cared for in a way she hadn't expected. And in that moment, Ellen knew. As the days turned into weeks, Ellen found herself grappling with feelings she had never expected. Her healing was slow but steady, and every day brought a small victory, a little more strength in her legs, a little less pain in her chest. But with each step forward in her physical health, she also found herself getting closer to an emotional realization that left her both excited and uncertain. She had come to count on Michael, not just for the financial and emotional support he had provided, but for something deeper. Something that had taken root in her heart without her even noticing. It was as if the care he had shown her had become a bridge to something more, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope, and even the beginnings of love. Michael had been with her through it all, through the darkest days of her illness, through the sleepless nights when pain and fear had kept her awake, and through the small, quiet times when all she needed was someone to sit with her in silence. He had been her rock. And now, as she began to regain her strength, Ellen couldn't deny that her feelings for him had changed into something more than just gratitude. One afternoon, as Ellen sat by the window in her hospital room, watching the sunlight filter through the trees outside, Michael arrived with his normal warm smile. He carried a small bouquet of flowers, which he put on the table next to her bed. "You didn't have to bring those," Ellen said, though her heart warmed at the effort. "I wanted to," Michael answered, sitting down in the chair next to her. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Ellen said with a smile. "Stronger." Michael nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "I'm glad to hear that. You're doing amazing, Ellen. You've come so far." Ellen looked away for a moment, her mind rushing with thoughts she had tried to push aside for weeks. But now, sitting here with Michael, she couldn't ignore them any longer. "Michael," she began nervously, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something." Michael's expression got serious as he leaned forward, his full attention on her. "What is it, Ellen?" She took a deep breath, her heart beating in her chest. "You've been so kind to me, so much more than I ever could have asked for. And I've been trying to figure out how to say this, but Her words trailed off, and for a moment there was only the sound of the wind outside, gently moving the leaves. His full attention was on her now, his eyes searching hers with a mixture of curiosity and worry. "You've done so much for me, more than I could ever ask for," Ellen added, her heart pounding in her chest. "And I've been trying to figure out how to thank you, how to repay you, but the truth is, I don't think it's just gratitude I'm feeling anymore." Michael's face softened, and he leaned forward slightly as if to encourage her to keep going. I think I'm starting to feel something more," Ellen admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I didn't expect. I don't know what it means or if I'm even ready to feel it, but it's there. And I don't know if you feel it too." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Ellen felt her heart race as she waited for Michael to react, unsure of what he would say or if she had just made a terrible mistake. Michael's eyes softened, and he reached out to take her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "Ellen," he began, his voice low and steady, "you have no idea how much you mean to me." Ellen's breath caught in her throat as she looked up at him, her eyes wide with expectation. "I've been trying to keep my feelings in check," Michael continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "because the last thing I wanted was to make things harder for you. But the truth is, I've felt it too, for a while now. I just didn't know how to say it or if it was the right time." Ellen's heart swelled with feeling, a mix of relief and joy washing over her. She hadn't been picturing it. The link between them was real, and Michael felt it just as strongly as she did. "I care about you, Ellen," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper now, "more than I ever thought possible. And I don't want to rush anything, but I want you to know that whatever you're feeling, I'm right there with you." Ellen felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of relief that rushed through her. She had been so afraid to admit her feelings, so unsure of what would happen if she did. But now, hearing Michael say those words, she understood that she didn't have to be afraid anymore. "I don't know what comes next," Ellen said softly, her voice shaking with emotion, "but I do know that I want you to be a part of it." Michael smiled, his hand squeezing hers gently. "We'll figure it out together." They sat there in the fading light, their hands clasped together, the unspoken understanding between them getting stronger with each passing moment. It wasn't just about kindness or thanks anymore. It was something deeper, something that had taken root and grown into something beautiful. For the first time in a long while, Ellen allowed herself to believe in the chance of a future that was filled with more than just recovery. It was a future that included Michael, and the thought of that filled her heart with a sense of hope and happiness she hadn't felt in years. Ellen had never been the type to wear her heart on her sleeve, but ever since her quiet statement to Michael, she felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. The weight of doubt, of not knowing where they stood, had been lifted. There was clarity between them now, a shared understanding that had taken root during those long, quiet days in the hospital. But even with that weight lifted, there was still so much left unspoken. The next few days passed in a blur of treatments and small changes. Ellen was getting stronger, strong enough that the doctors started talking about her eventual release from the hospital. It was good news, and yet it brought with it a new set of fears. What would happen after she went home? How would things change between her and Michael now that their feelings were out in the open? One afternoon, as they sat in her hospital room, the talk finally turned to the inevitable. "So," Ellen said, her voice light but filled with underlying anxiety, "the doctors think I might be able to go home soon." Michael looked up from the book he had been reading, his face brightening. "That's great news." Ellen nodded, her hands playing with the blanket that covered her legs. "It is. I'm excited, of course, but I guess I'm also a little nervous." Michael frowned slightly, closing the book and setting it aside. "Nervous about what?" Ellen paused for a moment, then sighed. "About what happens next. I mean, we've been here in this bubble for weeks now. Everything's been about my treatment, about getting better. But once I go home, things are going to change, aren't they?" Michael's eyes softened, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he looked at her. "Things don't have to change, Ellen. Not between us." Ellen let out a small laugh, though there was little humor in it. "I know, but it's easy to say that now when we're still here. What if things get complicated?" Michael reached out, taking her hand in his. "Things are already complicated," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean we can't figure it out. I'm not going anywhere, Ellen, no matter what happens." Ellen met his eyes, her heart swelling at his words. She wanted to believe him, and deep down, she knew he meant it. But there was still that small, nagging question in the back of her mind, the fear that once they left the safety of the hospital, everything would feel different. "I just don't want to lose what we have," she whispered. "You won't," Michael promised her. "We'll take it one day at a time. You're not in this alone, Ellen. I'm here for whatever comes next." Ellen smiled, feeling a sense of happiness spread through her. Michael's presence, his steadfast support, had been a constant throughout her recovery. And now, knowing that he was committed to staying by her side, she felt a weight lift from her chest. A few days later, Ellen was finally released from the hospital. It was a sad moment. She was glad to be going home, but there was a part of her that would miss the routine of the hospital, the safety net that had been there during her most vulnerable days. But she wasn't going home alone. Michael had insisted on driving her, making sure she was comfy and cared for every step of the way. As they drove down the long, winding road that led out of the city and back toward Green Hollow, Ellen found herself staring out the window, watching the landscape change from tall buildings and crowded streets to open fields and wide, empty skies. It was strange being back in the world after so many weeks limited to a hospital bed. The air felt fresher, the sun warmer, but there was also a sense of anxiety that hung over her. "What are you thinking about?" Michael asked, looking over at her as he drove. Ellen turned to look at him, her lips twisting into a small smile. "I don't know, just everything, I guess. It's strange to be out here again, to be going home." Michael nodded, understanding. "It's a big change after everything you've been through. But you're stronger now. You've come a long way." Ellen smiled, appreciating his words, but her thoughts kept moving back to what came next, not just for her, but for them. When they arrived at the farm, John and Mary were waiting on the steps, their faces lighting up with joy at the sight of Ellen. They rushed down the steps to meet her, pulling her into a warm embrace. John's eyes were misty as he hugged his daughter, and Mary's smile was bigger than Ellen had seen in months. "You're home," Mary said quietly, brushing a strand of Ellen's hair behind her ear. "You're finally home." Ellen nodded, her throat tight with feeling. It felt good to be home, to be surrounded by the usual sights and smells of the farm. But as she looked over at Michael, who was standing a few feet away, watching the reunion with a small smile, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved between them. That evening, after John and Mary had gone to bed, Ellen found herself sitting on the porch, looking out at the dark fields. The air was cool, and the stars twinkled above her, casting a soft glow over the scenery. She heard the creak of the porch door behind her and turned to see Michael stepping outside, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. Ellen shook her head, pointing to the empty space beside her. "Not at all." Michael sat down next to her, the two of them sitting in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the stars. Ellen could feel the tension building inside her, the unspoken words she had been holding since they left the hospital, bubbling up to the surface. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice quiet in the stillness of the night. "About us." Michael turned to look at her, his face calm but attentive. "What about us?" Ellen took a big breath, gathering her thoughts. "I meant what I said before in the hospital, about how I feel. But now that I'm home, I just want to be sure we're on the same page." Michael reached over, taking her hand in his. "Ellen, I've been sure about this for a long time. I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone, and I don't want to rush anything, but I also don't want to pretend like what we have isn't real." Ellen's heart swelled at his words, a sense of relief washing over her. She had been so scared that things would change, that the feelings they had shared in the hospital would somehow fade once they were back in the real world. But hearing Michael say those things, knowing that he was just as committed as she was, made her feel like everything would be okay. "I don't know what the future holds," Ellen admitted, her voice shaking slightly, "but I know I want you to be a part of it." Michael smiled, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Then that's all that matters." They sat there together on the porch, their hands clasped tightly, the night stretching out before them like a promise of something new, something hopeful. Ellen didn't know where their trip would take them, but for the first time in a long while she wasn't afraid to find out. And as they sat there, side by side, Ellen allowed herself to believe in the chance of a future that was filled with love, with hope, and with the kind of happiness she had thought she would never feel again. "I don't want to pretend either," she whispered. Michael smiled, his hand squeezing hers gently. "Then we don't have to. We'll take things as they come, together." And in that moment, under the great night sky, Ellen felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, she wouldn't be facing it alone. The days that followed Ellen's return to the farm were filled with a sense of peace that she hadn't experienced in months. The weight of her illness had started to lift, and each morning she woke up feeling just a little bit stronger. Her body was healing, slowly but surely, and with that healing came a greater clarity about what she wanted for her future, both for herself and for her relationship with Michael. Michael had stayed in Green Hollow, renting a small place nearby so he could continue to be close to her and her family. He didn't want to push her, and their time together had become a delicate balance between giving her space to heal and being there for her whenever she needed him. They spent their days walking around the farm, talking about life, their hopes, and even their fears. It felt like they were building something real, something that went beyond the boundaries of gratitude or obligation. Ellen, though still careful, felt her heart opening more each day. There was a part of her that had been holding back, afraid that the link they had built in the hospital wouldn't translate to real life. But as the days turned into weeks, those fears began to fade. Michael had shown her, time and again, that he was here for the long haul. One evening, as they sat together under the stars once again, Ellen found herself thinking on how far she had come. It was strange to think that just a few months ago she had been lying in a hospital bed, unsure if she would even live. And now, here she was, not just surviving, but starting to thrive. "I've been thinking," Ellen said, her voice soft in the quiet of the night. Michael turned to look at her, his face curious but patient. "About what?" "About everything," Ellen answered, her eyes drifting toward the dark fields that stretched out before them. "About the farm. About my parents, about us." Michael's gaze softened, and he moved slightly in his seat, giving her his full attention. "What's on your mind?" Ellen took a big breath, gathering her thoughts. "I think for a long time, I was afraid to imagine a future for myself. The illness took so much from me, and there were days when I didn't think I'd ever get better. But now I can finally start thinking about the future again, and I want you to be a part of it." Michael's expression stayed calm, but Ellen could see the flicker of emotion in his eyes. "I want that too, Ellen," he said quietly. "I've wanted that for a while now." Ellen smiled, feeling a wave of warmth in her chest. "It's just, everything feels so different now. I feel different, stronger, more hopeful, and I think a part of that is because of you." Michael's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers softly. "You've always been strong, Ellen. You didn't need me to show you that, but I'm glad if I've been able to help." Ellen leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing beneath her. "I don't know what comes next," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that whatever it is, I want us to face it together." Michael wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "We will," he promised, one step at a time. Over the next few weeks, as Ellen continued to regain her health, she and Michael became inseparable. They spent nearly every day together, their bond deepening with each shared moment, every laugh, and every quiet talk. John and Mary had taken notice, and while John remained cautiously optimistic about the blossoming relationship between his daughter and Michael, Mary couldn't hide her joy. "You know, I think they're good for each other," Mary said one evening as she and John sat together on the porch, watching the sunset behind the hills. John, his arms crossed over his chest, looked over at her. "You think so?" Mary nodded, her smile soft. "I do. Ellen's been through so much, and for a while there, I didn't think we'd ever see her smile again. But now, look at her. She's happy, and I think Michael has a lot to do with that." John was quiet for a moment, watching as Michael and Ellen walked hand in hand across the field, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. He couldn't deny that his daughter seemed happy, healthier than she had in months. And Michael, well, John had to admit that the young man had proven himself time and again. He had been there for Ellen in ways John couldn't, and for that he was grateful. "I suppose you're right," John said finally, his voice gruff but not unkind. "He's been good to her." Mary smiled, patting his knee lovingly. "You'll see, John, this is a good thing for Ellen." The days were filled with a fresh sense of purpose. Ellen began helping out around the farm again, taking on small jobs that made her feel like she was contributing once more. Her body was still recovering, and there were days when tiredness crept up on her, but she didn't let it stop her. Each step forward felt like a win, and she clung to that sense of progress with both hands. One afternoon, as she and Michael were walking through the fields, Ellen suddenly stopped, turning to face him. "Michael," she started, her tone serious, "there's something I need to say." Michael stopped, his brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Ellen took a big breath, her heart racing. "I don't know if I've said this enough, but I'm so grateful for everything you've done for me. You saved my life in more ways than one, and I don't just mean the hospital or the doctors or the treatments. You've been there for me every step of the way, and I—" Michael gently put his hand on her cheek, cutting her off with a tender look. "Ellen, you don't have to thank me. I did what I did because I care about you. Because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Ellen felt like the world had stopped. She stared up at him, her heart beating in her chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to truly feel what had been building inside her all this time. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Michael's smile was soft, but there was a depth to his eyes that made Ellen's heart grow. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and in that moment, under the vast open sky of Green Hollow, Ellen knew that she had found something she hadn't even realized she was looking for. A future filled with hope, love, and the promise of something more. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's hug, the world around them fading into the background. Whatever difficulties lay ahead, they would face them together. And for the first time in a long while, Ellen felt like everything was going to be okay. The bond between Ellen and Michael had grown stronger with each passing day. And now, with their feelings for each other fully out in the open, it felt like the final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. Life in Green Hollow had settled into a peaceful pace. Ellen was recovering well, the farm was running smoothly, and the sense of hope and happiness that had once seemed so distant was now a regular presence in their lives. But there was one last bridge to cross. While Ellen had accepted her feelings for Michael, and Michael had made it clear that he was committed to her and her family, John had yet to fully come to terms with the idea. He trusted Michael, but the thought of his daughter being in a relationship with someone who had come into their lives under such strange circumstances still made him cautious. One evening, after a long day of working on the farm, John sat on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The familiar smell of earth and grass filled the air, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and pink. It was a scene John had seen countless times before, but tonight his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Ellen, about how much she had been through, and how much she had changed since Michael had come back into their lives. Mary joined him on the porch, giving him a cup of coffee as she sat down beside him. "You're quiet tonight," she noticed, her voice gentle. John took a sip of the coffee, nodding slightly. "Just thinking." "About Ellen and Michael?" Mary asked, her tone knowing. John let out a long sigh. "Yeah, I can't help it, Mary. I know Michael's been good to us, better than we could have ever asked for, but it's still hard for me. I just want to make sure she's going to be all right." Mary smiled softly, putting her hand on his arm. "I understand. You're her father, and you'll always worry about her. But you've seen how happy she is. Michael's been there for her every step of the way, and he's proven that he cares about her. I think it's time we trust that." John stared out at the fields, his face thoughtful. I do trust him," he revealed. "It's just, this whole thing still feels so unreal. All these years we struggled, and then Michael came back out of nowhere. It's like a dream, and I'm afraid we're going to wake up and find out it wasn't real." Mary's smile grew as she leaned against his shoulder. "John, sometimes life gives us a break when we least expect it. And after everything Ellen's been through, I think she deserves this happiness. Don't you?" John was quiet for a moment before he nodded slowly. "Yeah, she does." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching as the last rays of sunshine faded from the sky. Inside the house, Ellen and Michael were talking quietly, laughter occasionally moving out to the porch where John and Mary sat. It was a sound that filled John's heart with a mix of emotions: pride, relief, and most of all, hope for the future. As the weeks turned into months, the seasons changed, and Green Hollow began to prepare for the arrival of winter. The days grew shorter, the air crisper, and the leaves on the trees turned beautiful shades of gold and red. It was a time of change, not just for the land, but for Ellen and her family as well. With her health fully restored, Ellen was once again an important part of the farm. She and Michael worked side by side, their friendship unshakable. The love they shared had become a source of power, not just for them, but for everyone around them. Even John, though still guarded, had come to accept that Michael was a part of their family now. After dinner, as the plates were cleaned and the evening began to wind down, John asked Michael to step outside with him. The two men stood on the porch, the cool night air surrounding them, the sounds of the farm falling into its nighttime quiet. "Michael," John started, his voice calm but serious, "there's something I need to say." Michael turned to face him, his look attentive. "Of course, Mr. John. What's on your mind?" John hesitated for a moment, looking for the right words. I've watched you and Ellen grow close over these past few months, and I can see how much you care about her. She means the world to me, and I just want to make sure that whatever this is between you two, you're in it for the right reasons." Michael met John's eyes, his expression steady. "Mr. John, I understand your concerns, and I want you to know that my feelings for Ellen aren't something I take lightly. I love her. I've loved her for a while now, and I want to build a future with her. This isn't about paying back a debt or anything like that. It's real." John nodded slowly, taking in Michael's words. There was something about the way Michael spoke, earnest and sincere, that eased the remaining doubts in his mind. It was clear that this young man, the same boy he had once helped all those years ago, had grown into someone who was not only capable of caring for his daughter, but who truly wanted to be a part of their family. "I believe you," John said finally, his voice soft but strong. "And I want you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've done. You've given Ellen a second chance at life, and for that I'll always be thankful. But more than that, you've become part of our family." Michael's eyes softened, and he nodded, clearly touched by John's words. "Thank you, Mr. John. That means more to me than you know." John reached out and clasped Michael's shoulder, his grip strong. "Just take care of her. That's all I ask." "I will," Michael promised, his voice steady. "You have my word." With that, a sense of peace settled over John. He had spent so much time worrying about the future, about what would happen to Ellen. But now, standing there with Michael, he understood that things had changed. Ellen wasn't just his little girl anymore. She was a woman who had been through more than most, and she had found someone who truly cared for her. As they rejoined the family, the air between them lighter, John caught Ellen's eye. She smiled at him, a knowing look in her gaze, and John felt his heart swell with pride. She was going to be all right. They all were. That night, as John lay in bed beside Mary, he felt a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in years. The farm was quiet, the night air cool against the open window, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to rest. His family was whole again, and for that, he was deeply, profoundly thankful. The following weeks felt like a dream, one where every moment was filled with warmth, love, and the quiet satisfaction of lives falling into place. The farm bustled with life again as Ellen continued to regain her strength, and with Michael by her side, the once daunting tasks of the future now seemed manageable. Ellen had taken on more tasks around the farm, and the work, which had once been a burden, now felt like a joy. Every morning, she would wake up with a sense of purpose, knowing that each day brought her closer to full health. Her health was slowly improving, and the doctors had assured her that with time and care, she would continue to get stronger. But it wasn't just her physical health that had changed. Her heart had, too. The bond she shared with Michael had strengthened in ways she hadn't thought possible. What had started as a simple act of gratitude had grown into something far more profound. It was love, real and undeniable, and for the first time in a long while, Ellen felt like her future was filled with options. One afternoon, as Ellen and Michael worked together in the fields, planting seeds for the upcoming season, Ellen stopped to take in the sight around her. The fields stretched out in front of them, the sun shining down on the fresh earth. It was a scene of renewal, of life starting again after a long winter. And as she looked over at Michael, who was focused on his work, she felt a surge of thanks wash over her. "This feels good," she said, breaking the relaxed silence between them. Michael looked up, wiping the sweat from his face with the back of his hand. "It does," he agreed, his smile easy. "It's like everything's finally coming together." Ellen nodded, her heart full. "I never thought I'd be here again doing this," she revealed. "There were times when I thought I'd never see these fields again. But now it feels like home." Michael stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers with a warmth that made her heart flutter. "This is home," he said softly, "and you're exactly where you're meant to be." Ellen smiled, reaching out to take his hand. They stood there for a moment, the wind slowly rustling the leaves of the trees around them, the world quiet and peaceful. In that stillness, Ellen felt the weight of the past months melt away, replaced by the joy of the moment and the hope of the future. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Ellen said, her voice serious. "About how much has changed, about how far we've come." Michael squeezed her hand, his eyes steady. "We've come a long way," he agreed, "and I wouldn't change any of it." Ellen smiled at his words, but there was a seriousness in her face as she continued. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, Michael. You saved my life more than once. Michael shook his head softly, his thumb brushing across her hand. You saved yourself, Ellen. I just gave you the chance to fight. Ellen's smile dimmed and she felt a lump form in her throat. I don't know how I can ever repay you for what you've done, for me, for my family. Michael looked at her, his face tender but firm. You don't need to repay me. You and your family gave me everything when I had nothing. This, all of this, it's just the cycle coming back around. Ellen's heart swelled at his words. It was true. What had started with her father's act of kindness all those years ago had come full circle. Michael had returned that kindness in ways they could never have imagined. And now, standing here with him, Ellen felt the full weight of that link. It's amazing how one small act can change everything, she said softly. Michael nodded, his eyes drifting toward the fields. It is. Your father gave me a second chance at life, and now we've found something even more because of it. Ellen leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. As they stood there, taking in the beauty of the moment, she thought about her father, about the man who had given everything to help someone in need, never expecting anything in return. And now, because of that simple act of kindness, their lives had been forever changed. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the family gathered around the dinner table, the talk was light and filled with laughter. John and Mary sat at one end, their faces shining with happiness as they watched their daughter, strong and healthy, smile and laugh alongside Michael. The joy in the room was obvious, and for John, it was a moment of deep pride. His family had been through so much, hardship, illness, fear. And yet here they were, together, stronger than ever. And Michael? Well, John had come to think of Michael as part of the family now. The young man who had once been a stranger had become someone they couldn't imagine their lives without. As the meal came to a finish, John cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. I want to say something, he started, his voice a little rough but filled with emotion. We've all been through a lot these past few months, and I know I don't say it often, but I'm proud of all of us. Proud of this family. Mary smiled at him, her eyes soft with love, and Ellen's hand found Michael's under the table. John continued, his eyes settling on Michael. Michael, you've been more than a friend to us. You've been family. And I want you to know that no matter what, you'll always have a place here. You've done more for us than I could ever repay, and we're forever grateful. Michael, clearly moved by John's words, nodded, his voice quiet but steady as he answered. Thank you, Mr. John. This place has been more of a home to me than anywhere I've ever been. I'm just glad I could be here for all of you. The room fell into a comfortable silence after that, the weight of John's words hanging in the air like a quiet gift. Ellen glanced over at Michael, her heart full, and in that moment she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the night drew to a close, Ellen found herself standing outside, looking up at the stars. Michael joined her, his hand slipping into hers as they stood in the cool night air. You know, Ellen said softly, I think we're going to be okay. Michael smiled, his eyes reflecting the light of the stars above them. Yeah, I think we are. And as they stood there, under the great expanse of the night sky, Ellen felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The circle of life, of love, and of second chances had brought them here, to this moment, to this place, to each other. And for that, she was infinitely thankful. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Every click helps us share more meaningful stories with you. Let's keep this journey of emotions and inspiration alive together.